These indigenous evangelical Christians have been threatened, had their possessions taken away, and finally driven from their homes in July of 2011. In spite of promises from the state government to return them to their community, they remain homeless. So, what has caused this backlash towards these followers of Christ?
Healings were taking place and people were coming to Christ and baptisms were happening, and that angered the community and people as they saw things growing and out of control.
Eduardo Lopez Hernandez is the leader of the evangelical Christian community from Buena Vista Bahuts in the municipality of Las Margaritas. He says the local authorities tried to convince them to return to the majority religion, which is a mix of Catholicism and pagan rituals. He adds that wasn't going to happen. They prayed and stood together, and eventually things got violent.
There was a lot of physical aggression from the authorities. We were tied up, had ropes around our waists. We were pushed around and beaten. We were threatened to give up our faith. But our testimony was that we had seen the hand of God through healings and the glory of God through these healings, and there was no way we were going to turn our backs on our faith.
And that's meant having to move from place to place, seeking shelter, including living in tents in a park or in Sunday school classrooms in this evangelical church in Tuxtla Gutiérrez, the state capital of Chiapas. And that's where we caught up to Eduardo and more than 50 others, including 7 babies that were born after they were expelled.
In the beginning, it was difficult, but we were aware because of what the Bible teaches about what we are going through. We knew we weren't alone, and that God is with us, and that there is a purpose to what is happening to us.
Maria was just 10 years old when she and her family were driven from their home.
Pues empecé a estudiar y
The people from the community threatened to come out and look for us and kill us. As a group, we were afraid we would be caught in public by them. When we first were expelled, I was just a little girl, but I felt the Lord has been working in my life through the last few years, and it's been a good time for me.
Maria and the others would like to return home, and soon.
If it's the Lord's will to go back to our community, then I will go back with the same smile on my face and continue to serve the Lord.
The reason we want to go back is because we see where the gospel will grow there, and those people will come to Christ. But if for some reason we don't go back, we will continue to serve the Lord and be happy and content no matter what.
Luis Herrera is the president of the Voice of the Martyrs Mexico and responds to cases of persecution like the expulsion of these evangelicals from Buena Vista Bahuts through government and legal channels.
Sí es algo típico. Se firmó un acuerdo donde la
What happened in this case, and happens very often because of the pressure that something should be done and the government should be responding, there were several meetings, and these Christians were supposed to sign an agreement inside the community, and everything was set for them to return. But the community leaders wouldn't agree to what the government was promising and what the Christians agreed to. The problem is that the authorities in the communities have seen that there's no punishment, and they know the government won't do anything, so they continue persecuting.
Luis adds that the government often makes promises they know in advance the community leaders won't likely agree to, and then use these tactics to stall for time, hoping the evangelicals will just give up in their desire to return home. A growing evangelical church has also led to these believers, consisting of 10 families, being forced from their homes in the small farming village of Avellanel, located in the municipality of Ocosinco in northeast Chiapas State. This occurred after local authorities put 4 of the men in jail in May of 2013 and then expelled 4 of the 10 families. The 6 other families would be driven out later. Feliciano Ruiz Cruz, a husband, father, and grandfather who became an evangelical in 2011, was especially targeted.
When I first came to Christ, I started to share the gospel with the people of the community. I was the one responsible for the catechism, the Catholic doctrine, and that caused a lot of problems. An assembly meeting was held. We were called to the meeting, and when we wouldn't renounce Christ, they put us in jail for 6 nights.
During their time in jail, they got some rather hostile visitors.
There were people in the community that were harassing us when we were in jail and telling us to renounce our faith and return to Catholicism. But some believers came to encourage us, saying that what was happening was a part of the process when you first became a Christian, and reminded us about Paul, who persecuted Christians and then was persecuted. That encouraged us.
Feliciano Jr. was put in prison along with his father and says he never considered renouncing his faith, and the young husband and father holds no bitterness to those in the community, which is just 100 meters away from where they were living when we met up with them.
I don't feel any anger towards them, but I believe they still hold harsh feelings towards me and my family.
I've been able to forgive them because when I read the Bible, I know that it is teaching about this. I have been forgiven, so I forgive others. People are coming to Christ because of what they have seen with us, our behavior, and watching what we're going through, because we are preaching the truth and telling the real story of Jesus.
These believers were forced to sign papers saying they would leave their houses, but with the help of Pastor Sebastian Luis Cruz, filed a formal complaint with the religious affairs and other government offices, bringing awareness of the situation. Sebastian is also a church planter and is working with other denominations in 10 communities where there are no evangelical churches. I asked him if he is concerned for his safety in these places hostile to the gospel.
Yes, there is concern for that. But when you are sharing the gospel, you are going to be entering into the mouth of the lion. But he has called us to plant churches. What we are doing is looking at a strategy so we can go into these communities as wise as serpents.
There have been numerous reports of the persecution of evangelical Christians in 9 of the 31 states in Mexico that have been reported on in recent years. The most documented and investigated place where persecution is happening is in Chiapas State, right here. Now, that's not to say that there isn't persecution of the followers of Christ taking place in other states.
Well, actually, we know that there's more persecution because we have visited several other states and talked to people. But we haven't been working there for long. And in a lot of the states, people don't talk about it. People are very quiet about it. They're afraid of what will happen to them if they say anything. So we're just beginning to get to the point where on a national level, people have confidence in us to share.
Linda Picard, who is an American citizen and has lived in Mexico for more than 25 years, says the opposition of evangelical Christians is complicated.
It's not just the clash and the conflict between a religious system, but with those people who are involved in the majority religion, they are combining with armed groups, drug cartel groups, and the mix of that makes it much more dangerous for Christians or for pastors or evangelists in those areas where there is that type of penetration.
The problem is that the authorities in the communities have seen that there's no punishment, and they know the government won't do anything, so they continue persecuting.
The Voice of the Martyrs Canada is partnering with VOM Mexico in a variety of ways to help the mission to become strong and self-supporting.
It's been a really special relationship with the office in Canada with a number of the people that were there who have responded to us. They listen. They really want to learn and they want to know what's happening here. And then there's been the support and the encouragement with projects.
One of those who has been encouraged by these projects is Miguel Aura Batista. Miguel leads a busy life as a husband and father of 5 children. He is also the lay pastor of a rural church near San Antonio, Buena Vista. There were very few problems with the local community. That is, until the small evangelical church began to grow.
Entonces hubo un conflicto religioso porque los católicos se dieron cuenta.
There was a religious conflict. First, there was a small group of evangelicals here, but we began to grow. This was a real concern for the traditionalists. They feared that in time, there would be a large group of evangelicals. Things then got worse when the religious festivals came, and we didn't participate.
These religious festivals often involve pagan rituals and heavy drinking. In May of 2010, the local authorities decided they were going to stop the growth of evangelical churches in the area. So they went around with a mob of 200 armed people and cut the water and lights to the homes of believers. One of the newer Christian families fired on the mob.
That day, when the community decided to cut the lights, there was a shootout. I fled the area with my family. There was an attempt by the authorities to falsely accuse the Christians, especially those who were known to be involved in church planting. I was a specific target. I was on a list of 5 evangelicals they were looking for. Later, when I came back, my taxi was stolen. I had no way to support my family.
On the day of the shooting, Miguel's elderly father Pedro and his brother were in a nearby town selling their crops. Pedro and his son were picked up by community police and falsely charged with being involved in the shooting, even though they were nowhere near where the incident occurred. They were targeted because they were evangelicals and then later sentenced to 5.5 years in prison for something they had absolutely nothing to do with.
Mi esposa y no tengo dinero.
My concern was my wife when I was in prison. Who was going to take care of her? And then my children, and the rest of the brothers who were all living here. I was concerned about how they were going to survive. They couldn't work openly because they're evangelicals. They were getting beat up by those in the community. Many left the area to work, and some took out loans. I was worried about the legal fees. We're still trying to pay off those loans.
I was really upset and sad when this happened. All the men had to leave. They couldn't stay in the community. Me and 3 of my daughters remained here. I was worried about being here and how to take care of the rest of the family. During that time, one of our relatives told us to stop following God. But our daughter, a Sunday school teacher, said this was one of God's tests, and at the same time, our neighbors were threatening to burn down our house and the church with gasoline. But my daughter encouraged us to keep following Christ.
Pedro and his son would spend 3 years and 3 months in a brutal Mexican prison for a crime they didn't commit, having to pay protection money to the guards to avoid getting beat up by the other prisoners. They are also mocked because of their faith.
The prisoners harassed us and would say, if your God is true and if your religion is true, how come Jesus can't save you? How come your Jesus can't get you out of here?
Pedro, who has a strong faith in Jesus Christ, has chosen to forgive those responsible for putting him and his son in prison and causing his family so much harm.
The community is still angry with me, but we have been able to forgive the people who were responsible for putting us in prison.
I am now very thankful and happy to have my husband back beside me. We are starting our life again. This has encouraged us to see how the Lord has responded to us through our time of need.
The Voice of the Martyrs Mexico is helping Miguel and his family as their legal representative, and in conjunction with VOM Canada, have provided Miguel with a microloan for his taxi business.
My first contact with VOM Mexico was when they provided food baskets that went to my father and brother in prison, and they had a relationship with my family. Then last year, the project's person from VOM Canada came and heard our story and wanted to help, so they provided a microloan to buy a taxi. Our vision and desire is that this church keep on growing and continue to minister to our people.
According to VOM Mexico, about 2/3 of the cases of persecution against evangelicals that they receive are committed against indigenous believers. Antonio Perez Perez is a radio preacher and pastor in the municipality of Zinacatan in the central Chiapas Highlands. 99% of the population is Tzotzil, an indigenous people group. Antonio started his church in 2005 with just 10 people.
We started to preach the gospel, and the church started growing, and people around here not wanting the gospel to spread started threatening us, and about taking away our house and lands. The Indian customs here celebrate the festivals of the different patron saints, and we are required to participate. We're required to light candles. But since our people accepted Christ, they no longer want to do that. After some time, they arrested one of our members at the church and put him in a small prison here.
Antonio and his wife Rosa have 8 children from the ages of 3 to 18. They also had 2 children that passed away. Their life here as evangelicals is very difficult.
For me, it's important to keep going further to follow Christ, even with what we are going through and the suffering.
We have been physically attacked. Some have been stripped naked, and they put chili on the eyes and private parts as punishment. Some have been arrested.
Antonio says that even though there was pressure put on the evangelicals to return to the traditional religion, like cutting the power and water to their homes, their faith has remained strong.
We never thought about going back and participating in the customs. We did try going to the government and camped out in front of the government building in 2009 in the capital city of Tuxtla. We hoped the government would listen about our situation, but they didn't pay any attention. When we came back, the lights were put back on, but they never reconnected the water. With all the persecution, people start praying more and turn more to God, and the church is growing. Our people are motivated to go out to other communities to share the gospel, so the persecution is helping to advance the kingdom, to grow.
The radio ministry is also expanding and increasing in its reach in Chiapas. And as a result, more people are hearing and then responding to the gospel in areas where the traditional religion has a strong grip on the people. However, that isn't stopping them from calling the station. The need now? More Bibles. It's these kinds of results that encourage Antonio and keep him moving forward in his ministry to the Lord, in spite of the many challenges. Our VOM team had the privilege of praying for this devoted man of God. Daniel, not his real name, and we've hidden his identity for security reasons, is an evangelist with a desire and mission to reach Muslims for the gospel in Mexico. Now, even though Muslims are very, very small in number in the country, they are growing and are targeting indigenous evangelicals. Some have even accepted Islam. Daniel says evangelical churches need to be concerned, which is why he goes throughout the country meeting with Christian leaders.
I want the body of Christ in Mexico on a national level to know the risk. There isn't violence right now, but we need to be aware of what could develop over a period of time. My other concern is at a local level here, is that people who were evangelicals are becoming the first converts of Islam.
Daniel adds that the mosque is being built in a strong evangelical area of San Cristobal, where many people from indigenous communities now live.
When the mosque is finished and they start the 5 calls to prayer each day, the evangelicals are going to be irritated and they are going to respond. I can't say there will be violence, but I do expect there will be some kind of conflict.
Daniel has worked in transcultural missions, It says because the Quran teaches complete submission to Allah, that breaks apart families when they accept Islam.
It concerns me that the Muslims are focusing on the indigenous for Islam. If they become Muslims, their ties to their families and culture will be eliminated. Many Muslims here are from indigenous backgrounds and are my friends. I've been able to talk to them in a reasonable manner. If there is a possibility, I'd someday like to see them come back to Christ, and for those who didn't really have a real Christian faith, to come to Jesus.
What makes this mosque in San Cristobal, which is financed from outside of Mexico, so troubling is that the leader is the grandson of Miguel Gomez Hernandez, who was among the first martyrs in Chamula back in 1981.
I said to one woman of this family, I don't understand how it is that your grandfather was willing to die for his Christian faith and how you rejected his faith and became Muslims. This young woman went to Spain for 4 years where she was prepared for the Islam faith. I asked her if she was willing to die like her grandfather, who was kidnapped by several men, skinned alive, his eyes poked out, his tongue was cut out, and then had his body hung up on a tree. She said she was willing to die for Islam, but not like her grandfather. To think that the first Muslims here in Chiapas are relatives, descendants of the first martyr here. How could they leave their faith, believing in Jesus, to reject that and go into Islam? My heart is, I want to do something so that this isn't such a possibility.
In the midst of the many challenges, the gospel is advancing all over Chiapas State, and in fact, the entire country. The Voice of the Martyrs Mexico will continue to bring encouragement through practical needs, both physical and spiritual, and through instruction and friendship, and to stand with those who are willing to pay the price to see God's word penetrate many hearts and lives.